Welcome to the Free Court Show with your host, Jason Hartman. No, Jason's not a lawyer. He's just a regular businessman, a regular consumer. The legal system is broken and most people cannot access it. Jason and his powerful guests are here to help level the playing field so that you, the consumer, can better understand your rights, have options and recourse, and listen to the experts explore new products and services so that you can be an empowered citizen in the system. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman.
It's my pleasure to welcome David Dorsen to the show. He is a former Assistant U.S. Attorney in New York under Robert Morgenthau, an Assistant Chief Counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee, and Assistant Chief Counsel during the Watergate hearings. He's author of The Unexpected Scalia, a Conservative Justice's Liberal Opinions, and the new book, Moses versus Trump, a Contemporary Novel. David, welcome. How are you?
Very fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good. It's good to have you. I'm guessing you're coming to us from New York. Is that correct?
No, actually from Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay. Not too far away?
Well, not too far away. No, I lived in New York when I was an assistant U.S. attorney and grew up there. Right. And then Robert Morgenthau was asked to recommend somebody to be Assistant Chief Counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee, and he recommended me, came to Washington, liked Washington, and here I am.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, let's go in chronological order. You've had a long and storied career. Watergate, let's start way back there. I think that was a really fascinating time in U.S. history. I've watched a lot on it, read a lot on it. Nixon was a very interesting character for sure. Give us a little overview of the Watergate hearings and your involvement there, if you would.
Sure. They essentially started with a burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in June of 1972, headed by one of the strangest people I've ever encountered, G. Gordon Liddy, who was a furious man who had contempt for everyone but the right wing. And there was a trial of the burglars, and Judge John Sirica, a judge who liberals did not like because he was so strict, gave the burglars a huge sentence, 30 years or so, because he felt that the burglars were lying when they said that they didn't go any higher than Liddy and Hunt and a couple of other people. And that prompted the United States Senate unanimously to appoint a committee, select committee, to investigate, and that was the committee I was Assistant Chief Counsel of. And in those days, there was partisanship, but it was nothing like it is today. You could never get a unanimous vote today to investigate anything. And we had hearings that were public, and what was remarkable was that I started as Assistant Chief Counsel in April of 1973, and just over a month later, we were on hearings, public hearings, televised hearings, 4 days a week. And we told the whole story in a way that really was remarkably clear and step by step, so that by the end of the hearings, everything was clearly laid out. And John Dean was our star witness. He had a photographic memory, was thorough and exacting. And he told all sorts of things about Nixon, including Nixon saying that it was fine and he could raise $1 million to bribe or to pay bribes for extortion from the burglars. And lo and behold, a month later, partly on information that John Dean provided, because he didn't know about this at all, but he led us to the taping system. Nixon had installed a comprehensive taping system in the White House
with missing portions.
And the reason he did it was to protect himself,
right? Yeah,
because he was afraid that people would distort what he said, and
it ended up hurting him, didn't it?
It killed him, right? Yeah. And he had no idea how badly it hurt him.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you: in the Watergate hearings, I mean, it would be interesting to ask someone about the Kennedy assassination this same question: was justice served?
Oh, I think so. The committee has gotten very, very little criticism over the years. We did a thorough job. It's unlike just about any congressional committee. It was not even a question. Everyone just sort of accepted what we did. We were totally transparent. We had a committee of 7 senators, 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans. And it was just like clockwork on television. Behind the scenes, it was utter chaos at times, but we did the job like no one else has, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Is there anything else you want to tell us about Watergate just quickly? I mean, it's old,
no,
it's old news, so I don't want
think of something and then I may inject it. But no, it is just a remarkable situation.
Yeah, right. No question about it. Okay, so moving forward in time here, let's talk about Scalia a bit. Now,
yes.
I assume you lean to the left politically. Would that be?
Very much so.
Very much so. So you're liberal. Scalia was a conservative.
Right.
Are you a fan of Scalia?
In some ways, let me tell you that we were in law school together. I met Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, in 1958. I actually met Ruth Ginsburg at Harvard also, but in 1957. And Justice Scalia and I, and both Ginsburg and I, were sort of friendly acquaintances. But then a couple of years after Bush v. Gore in 2000, I built up the courage to call him up and invite him over for dinner. And he and his wife came over, and we had dozens of those dinners over the years. And he was delightful. We disagreed just about everything. He was a very, very devout Catholic. I am not particularly religious. And we used to have these wonderful arguments and wonderful food, wonderful wine. And he was a delight. He listened. He was not dogmatic. He had his views. But he was, to ask anyone, Ruth Ginsburg was a liberal, and she felt the same way. So then what happened was, I got the idea, maybe I'll write a book about you. Nino is what everyone called him who knew him. And he didn't want me to write a biography, and I didn't because it was too personal. And I finally kind of said, you have all these liberal opinions. And he says, yeah, David, no one knows about them. So I said, I'll write a book.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us about his liberal opinions. I don't think too many people think of the late Justice Scalia as having liberal opinions, do they?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. What happened is this. He was an originalist, which basically in a sentence said that you construe the Constitution the same way as it would have been construed in 1789 or 1791. And what that meant to him was you really had to study history. And, for example, search and seizure. He found that the protections of the Fourth Amendment were rather broad, unlike most other conservatives. And whereas other conservatives, even Justice Clarence Thomas, who was an originalist, would shade things to the conservative side when it came to defendants' rights and freedom of speech and things like that, Justice Scalia generally, with one or two exceptions, if I may add, played it by the book, so that if history showed that a defendant would get a break in 1789, he got a break today. And that was true of right to trial by jury, certain sentencing matters, a whole host of matters that he put him with the liberals, and astonished his supporters to the extent they knew about it. He didn't particularly publicize it because he was conservative and he didn't like reaching some of these conclusions. However, most social issues like abortion, right to die and things like that, gun control, he was very much a conservative, and there we almost always disagreed.
Yeah, interesting. So there are some conspiracy theories surrounding Scalia's passing. What do you say to those?
I don't believe it. Actually, I still get together with his widow, and we talk about it. And I also spoke to the person who found his body. It was the doors locked on the inside. I'll tell you something that people generally don't know, and that is he suffered from apnea, which is an illness which actually I have. And we were sitting one day on my back porch talking about his problem sleeping. And finally I said, look, I have the same trouble. And that's when he learned he had apnea. And his case was fairly severe, and he always used to take a CPAP machine to help him breathe and keep his larynx open. He had it in Texas where he was on a hunting trip. He loved to hunt. But he had not turned it on, and his family successfully stopped an autopsy, which perhaps it shouldn't have because it would have put some of this nonsense to rest. But I believe he died from just constriction of the throat and apnea.
As the official story goes. What else do you want us to know about Scalia? And then let's talk about the Trump presidency. And I mean, there's so much, to talk about.
I know.
Just
let me tell you about Scalia. Well, Scalia was a delightful, unpretentious person. And he didn't stand on ceremony. We used to have a lot of fun together. At one time, I owned third owner of some racehorses, And he used to come to the track. We used to go to baseball games. We would go to the opera together. And he never made a fuss, and people would make a fuss over him. And the thing about him, he had a sense of humor. He was iconoclastic. And I think the Supreme Court is a lesser institution because he's not there anymore. I've talked to a couple of the justices on both sides of the aisle, and they really miss him. He was daring, he was disrespectful at times, not necessarily the greatest trait, but he was fun. He felt that everything should be fun, everything should be challenging. He'd ask impossible questions just to provoke discussion. He was a great writer, knew an awful lot, and the court had a big loss when he died. And I was not with him probably 90% of the time, but a lot of people, liberal and conservative, miss him.
Mm-hmm. As far as the Trump presidency goes, has Trump been cleared in your eyes, or
no.
Is there still something there that we don't know?
Well, let me say this. There were two major allegations that Robert Mueller and his team investigated. One was so-called collusion, and the other was obstruction of justice by Trump Trump in particular. The latter was not even dealt with by Mueller, and what happened was that a political appointee, William Barr, did something he shouldn't have done, and that is declared President Trump innocent of obstruction. We don't know what standard he used. We don't know what the facts are. So I'm certainly not there. With collusion, it's very complicated, and frankly, I never expected finding of collusion. I think Mueller, whom I respect and think did a generally excellent job, I think failed us not only by not making a decision on obstruction, but by not interviewing people, including the president, with respect to collusion. And I don't see how you can reach a conclusion that somebody was innocent of a crime that requires a very specific intent without speaking to that person. And Donald Trump is somebody who has bits and has bouts of candor, just like when he first said that he fired FBI Director James Comey because of his treatment of Hillary Clinton, something that nobody believed, and then he turned around and admitted it was because of Russia. Well, that's evidence of impropriety. It may not be collusion. Maybe the Russians and the Trump administration were working separately in the same direction. And that is something that also has to be explored, because Donald Trump was clearly pro-Russian in a way that Republicans have not been, and nobody has been in decades. So when you say no collusion, all it means, in my mind, if Mueller indeed said it, was that the two sides didn't exchange an agreement. And they could have both been doing the same thing for different reasons, because Donald Trump wanted to make a few $100 million by building a Trump Tower in Moscow. And I believe that's colored everything. So I'm not saying that I'm totally impartial in this, but I like to think I follow the evidence.
The interesting thing, though, is, on one hand, people can make the case that he's pro-Russia, but there seems to be a lot of squabbling. It seems like the Cold War is heating up a little bit, with Russia. I don't feel that the two countries are getting along very well. I mean, I've been to Russia twice as a tourist and a business person, and it seemed like Russia was a lot more U.S.-friendly back then, 15, 20 years ago, than it is today.
I agree with you. One of the problems with the Trump
these are two strong men. Putin's obviously a strong man. Trump's a strong man. Different styles of strong men, but they're
right. Exactly.
Obama just acquiesces to a lot of stuff, and that's kind of a different vibe, definitely. So I don't know. It's sort of hard for me to buy the argument that Trump is so pro-Russia. I don't.
Well, but he has never, to my knowledge, seriously criticized Putin or identified Putin with some terrible things that are going on in Russia. He has totally let Russia off the hook with Ukraine, with other countries, and the voting scandal that Russia hacked into our system. He has never chastised Russia, and my feeling is that his motive and his modus operandi is to leave the door open for business deals. He had one going while he was running for president, which he did not disclose. I think he ignores the advice of State Department and the intelligence people, which leads to a somewhat erratic and superficial handling of foreign policy. And I think that's dangerous. This is a very, very serious business, the foreign policy. For example, now Russia's moving into Africa, Russia's moving into Syria. There is a lot going on that is not good for the United States. And I think President Trump is failing to deal with the most important parts of the country's well-being and instead fixing on things that are less serious. I'm not saying they're not serious, but less serious, such as the southern border. So I think Donald Trump doesn't have his priorities correct, and he's misguided by situations where he favors his business. Now, going beyond that, I think Donald Trump and his children are in for a rough time now that I think the prosecution offices and other people are lining up to file civil suits and maybe even criminal cases, such as the district attorney of Manhattan, New York County, and the Attorney General of New York with respect to the foundation that Donald Trump set up and was so messed up that it had to be closed. So I think Donald Trump and his children are in for a very, very bad couple of years.
Well, we shall see. We shall see. You know, he has a lot of fans and a lot of people who aren't willing to say they're fans, which is exactly what I thought would happen in the last election. Trump supporters, love him or hate him, they don't want to get into the arguments. They don't want to be criticized, and they're just going to go in and vote, you know? I mean, certainly segments of them will show up at rallies and wear hats and all that kind of stuff, but the climate is pretty dangerous for them out there right now. You know, they've been attacked. You wear a hat, you won't get service at a restaurant. I mean, it's pretty crazy. I mean, these are all the people that say they're the tolerant ones that aren't being very tolerant.
Right. Well, there's something to what you say. Look, I'm not saying that liberals, and I do include myself, are perfect. I think at times we are intolerant. And I think that courtesy is lacking on both sides of the aisle. And I'm not saying that's not true. So one of the things that bothers me most, which was not true during Watergate, was that in Watergate you could have serious conversations with people who were supporters of Richard Nixon. Today it's very, very difficult to have serious conversations with people who are pro-Trump, not simply Republicans, not people who simply like some of his policies, but people who just admire him and will not allow you to criticize him. I asked somebody a question, and the first answer is, well, what Hillary was worse. And it's very unfortunate. I'm worried.
Yeah, well, we shall see how it all turns out. Anything else you'd like people to know about the books or any interesting stories?
The books, yes.
Yeah.
As I said, I've written a book on Justice Scalia, you said, and that was sort of a product of discussions between Justice Scalia and me. He was always available, and it's actually an interesting book about Justice Scalia's philosophy. My name is spelled Dorsen. The book is The Unexpected Scalia. And then there's my novel, Moses v. Trump, which is, and I'm not going to give anything away, except that it's a somewhat rollicking court book based on a hypothetical fantasy of a courtroom trial. And all sorts of things happen to all sorts of people. The central character is a judge, a flawed liberal judge. And all sorts of things happen, and twists and turns. And I'll just mention some of the people whose blurbs are on the back. John Dean, of course, of the Watergate fame. Derek Bach, who was president of Harvard and dean of Harvard Law School. And my favorite is Frank Serpico, the New York City detective who fought corruption in New York City. They all like the book, and I'm just mentioning it. It's available online, including Amazon and some other outlets, and a few stores have it.
Do you want to give it a website?
Well, it's better just to do it through Amazon, frankly.
Okay, good stuff. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some interesting history with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Free Court Show. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or the platform of your choice. You can find the show notes and resources for today's episode at freecourt.com. Remember that guests' opinions are their own and information is of general nature, so be sure to consult appropriate tax, legal, and other professionals for specific advice.